Well, a C-suite shakeup. Starbucks shares soaring on news that Chipotle's current CEO Brian Niccol is going to be taking over at the coffee giant. That's effective September 9th. On the flip side, we're looking at Chipotle shares under pressure here in early trading, off just about 13.5%. Now the big question on the street is whether or not Brian Niccol is going to transform Starbucks, and is he going to be that catalyst for the stock? We want to bring in Nick Setyan. He is the managing director of equity research at Wedbush Securities. We also have Danilo Gargiulo. He is a senior analyst at Bernstein. Great to have both of you. Nick, let me start with you. When you take into, the street very obviously excited about Brian Niccol being the new CEO of Starbucks. What do you think of his appointment and whether or not he's the right person for the job?
Look, I mean, the excitement is understandable, but if you go back and remember, when he came into Chipotle from Taco Bell, his job was to bring back, the loyal customer that Chipotle had lost because of the food crisis. His challenge here is to basically go after a new customer. And at the time, Chipotle had never done any kind of marketing, never any kind of menu innovation. The digital ball game was behind. So he brought in a lot of that because of his marketing background. And here, I'm just not sure what, he's going to be able to bring to the table at Starbucks. I mean, given the decades of experience around menu innovation, the digital, obviously, a game here. And again, unless he has the power to change macro headwinds to bring the lower income customer back to Starbucks, I'm just not sure what the game plan can be.
Dan, I want to bring you in here. Do you think that Brian is going to be a big enough tailwind for Starbucks to turn the stock around?
I think so. I mean, look, the example will be what happened with Chipotle. Just as Nick was saying before, there was a problem with really reigniting the consumer base after the food crisis that Chipotle has seen during the 15-16 era. And when Brian Niccol came in, the brand eventually became much more visible. And he started with this social media strategy that made Taco Bell today probably the most iconic brand for the Gen Z, which is, coincidentally, the part of the consumer base that is now fading at Starbucks. So I think he might have some toolkit that he could be playing into the Starbucks rebound era.
Danilo, what do you think, just the early assessments are that are taking place right now? And I guess as we try to figure out maybe what Starbucks is going to look like here, Danilo, under Brian Niccol, is it going to be very different, radically different than what we saw under Laxman?
I think Brian has navigated some pressures that are very similar to when he was at Chipotle, that are very similar to the ones that we are seeing today at Starbucks. Thinking through the improved mobile ordering experiences, creating some digital lanes to increase the off-premise demand, which is part of the reasons why Starbucks today cannot serve its customer base. Diversifying the supply chain, investing in people and labor, but also using some prudent pricing strategy, which created this positive value perception gap versus the peers that is really propelling Chipotle's stock and Chipotle's performance these days. So all these toolkits are predicated on the premise of moderation, right? I don't think that Brian is going to come out and propose any bold strategies straight away that are going to be turning around Starbucks in the near future. But the toolkit is out there, and he's proven himself over and over. And by the way, one of the things that he's done while he was at Chipotle was to move the headquarters from Denver to Newport Beach, which in a way kind of separated himself from the former leadership and from the former founder, but also created a wave on new people, new management coming into Chipotle to make it much more relevant for consumers going forward.
Nick, just to follow up on the point that Danilo was making there, what should investors be anticipating the timeline for this recovery to potentially look like? If it is going to be true that Brian is going to be able to apply these strategies and turn the stock around, how long might that take?
About 3 quarters. Once the anniversary, the negative 7% comp in Q2, I'm sure Brian will be credited with having turned Starbucks around. As you can tell, I'm a big skeptic here in terms of what Brian Niccol can bring. I think the challenges are much bigger, but obviously, given the comparison of a negative 7% year over year kind of down comp in Q2 and in their fiscal Q2. I think they'll have a decent comp going over that, and that's when you'll kind of see some of the fruits of his labor.
Nick, do they need to lower prices?
I think it's going to be very difficult for them to lower prices. I think they can potentially, go down a different strategy around a different, menu, et cetera, or some kind of, change on the margin in the menu to have lower prices. But ultimately, their challenge isn't the current customer, right? Their challenge is not the loyal customer. They continue to come in. They continue to spend more and come in more often. The challenge is going after that newer customer, and I think it's a challenge that Brian hasn't necessarily tackled previously.
All right, and Danilo, let's talk about Chipotle, because clearly we're seeing a lot of that excitement play out in Starbucks. If you take a look at Chipotle shares, they're under a tremendous amount of pressure this morning. Is that a bit of a surprise, given the fact that Jack Hartung, it sounds like the company is saying that he's now going to be staying on indefinitely, and maybe the shape or direction here of Chipotle might not change, maybe to the degree that Wall Street seems to be nervous about here this morning?
Yeah, I will agree with your assessment. I think it might have been a little bit of a surprise given the sudden change in Jack's role at Chipotle. But at the same time, I think the brand has evolved itself from being just a CEO-driven, CEO-led. And I think over time, it has proven itself that it's larger than its own management. Now they have really propelled this virtual cycle with the younger consumer base, having tapped into, new set of the population that previously was probably not being considered for Chipotle. Think about the importance of the Chipotlanes that is tapping into the, more convenient-oriented consumer. Well, those type of consumers are now much more familiar with the brand. And we are seeing that Chipotle is now working also in the small town, in university cities, areas where previously one would have never thought that Chipotle might be working. And so right now we're talking about a potentially a cookie cutter approach that Chipotle will need to be deploying into more areas and expand the number of units, which again, while we like, Brian's leadership at Chipotle, I think the brand has evolved beyond his management.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, Danilo, and it points to even further confusion about the degree of the pressure that we're seeing on Chipotle stock this morning. Nick, I want to give you the final word on this. Given the pressure that we are seeing the stock under, what does Chipotle have to do moving forward? Do you think it's just a continuation of the same and they'll have their say at the next earnings print?
Yeah, look, I think Chipotle's in a very good place, and I think they're in very good hands. Both Jack and both gentlemen here that are taking over. I credit both of them with the turnaround as much as I credit Brian Niccol with. So I think they're in very good hands. I think they're on autopilot, frankly, and not much has to change.
Danilo, I actually want to get one more quickly on you. I'm curious to what extent Starboard impacted the executive shakeup that we're seeing today. What's your take on that?
Hard to say. I would say clearly the investors were disappointed with management, both current shareholders as well as wannabe investors into Starbucks, and I think they've aired their frustrations over a long period of time. I think activists might have taken a decisive role into establishing the path forward for Starbucks. I don't know if that means that Starboard was, necessarily the kind of the investor poaching, quote unquote, Brian Niccol out of Chipotle. I think it was probably indicative of the wider investment base being a little bit frustrated with current management at Starbucks.
Danilo, was it more so the second quarter earnings, the disappointment there, the fact that they hadn't really proved that turnaround story? Could that also have, I guess, how much of that do you think contributed to this change and the timing of it?
Yeah, I think the conversation with investors that we've had indicated that investors were looking for upward trajectory into the quarter, meaning they were probably expecting to see some softness in Starbucks, but at the same time, they were hoping to see some exit rate being higher, indicative of the fact that the actions that management was taking were the appropriate ones, were the ones that would be able to make Starbucks get out of this situation of losing their customer base, as well as being unable to tap into the new consumer base, as Nick was saying before. So I think the frustration was less about the amount of decline and much more about the lack of positive catalyst from here on and positive trajectory into the performance.
All right, guys, we're going to have to leave it there, but really appreciate you joining us this morning. Nick Setyan, Managing Director of Equity Research at Wedbush. We also had Danilo Gargiulo. He's a senior analyst over at Bernstein. Thanks, guys.